Hi, I'm Dr. Mollie Marti with Resiliency Matters. This is where we take the big resilience research and best practices and break it down into small bite-sized pieces that you can begin using immediately to strengthen yourself and others. What if you could learn from an expert in loss, grief, and resilience? Would you spend the next 28 minutes with us? What if in the next 10 minutes you could hear how the experience of losing her mother at a young age led a woman to write a book that went on to sell more than 1 million copies? That's helping a whole lot of people. Would you hang out with us? Who is us? My other half today is author Hope Edelman. Hope is the author of Motherless Daughters, Letters from Motherless Daughters, Motherless Mothers, and a compelling memoir. Hope and I have spent hours talking about loss and grief and resilience and psychosocial processes and narrative therapy and anthropology and history and on and on. You get the message.
Yeah.
We actually, I think, started filming the show before the cameras went, because when we talk, we cover so much ground. And I am just thrilled that you're finally in the studio. Welcome.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. Yes.
So how did you get from your background in journalism and creative writing to the field of bereavement?
Well, I began as a journalist. I was a magazine editor and writer, and then I landed in a nonfiction writing program and discovered the personal essay. I started writing about stories from real life, and the story of losing my mom when I was 17 kept bubbling up to the surface in almost everything that I wrote. And I had been looking for a book about early mother loss at that point for almost 10 years, because I'm a reader, so I went to bookstores and libraries looking for help to understand why I was feeling and thinking the way I was feeling and thinking. And all the books at the time seemed to assume that you'd be an adult when your mom died. So being in this graduate writing program and slowly starting to meet other women who'd lost mothers when they were young, I took on the task of writing the book myself. Started doing a tremendous amount of research and interviewing experts and put it all together. And the first edition of that book came out 25 years ago, this year, actually, and I've done 2 updates since then to bring new research in.
So you also interviewed women who lost their mothers at an early age. And another way our life has intersected is amazing, that you were conducting this work in Iowa City when I lived there, and I was recently grieving the loss of my mother at an early age. So I was a fit for your research.
I could have interviewed you had we known each other, right?
But how did you go about finding the woman to interview for this book?
Well, I was writing the book in the early 1990s, so it was pre-internet. Right? And I couldn't just go online and look for women. So I put ads in the backs of newspapers. And do you remember those pieces of paper with the pull tabs at the bottom that we used to see everywhere back in the 90s and the 80s? So I put those up in cafes and women's bookstores and just said, if you've lost a mom when you were young and you're interested in sharing your story, please, call this number. And I was flooded with volunteers. There were so many women who wanted to share their stories because no one had ever said to them, your story matters and I'd like to hear it. And they'd been carrying their stories around all these years and revisiting them and revising them without an opportunity to share them. So I had far more volunteers than I could manage. And I wound up interviewing, I think, in person for that first book, 92-ish women for that book. And then I did a survey of about a couple hundred more.
And what you found I think the reason there was such a mass response is these women had been having that burden of silence, of not being able to share their stories. Right. What are those costs of silence?
Well, a lot of these women who were children and teenagers when their moms died, some of them had not been allowed to speak about their mothers. And they had lost their moms in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. My mom died in 1981, and the culture, Western culture at that time very much was about, don't talk about these things. We're going to get over it. We're going to move on. We're going to get past it. We're going to be future thinking and not revisit the past. Let's not talk about things that upset us. So as children and teenagers, they were sometimes prohibited from speaking about their moms. And what that did was it created a sense of isolation, this feeling that I'm the only girl who's been through this. Chances are they may not have known anyone else in their school or their neighborhood who lost a mom when they were young. So they felt aberrant, socially aberrant. And they just retreated into themselves with their stories and felt like, I'm different, nobody understands me. And so there was an opportunity then for someone to say, not only do I want to hear your story, but your story matters. And we would sit down and I would just press play on the tape recorder, and some women would speak for an hour or an hour and a half in perfectly formed paragraphs, as if the story had been sitting inside of them, waiting to come out. So they felt very isolated if they hadn't been able to share their story or had been forced into silence. And also their loss would get frozen in time. Their relationship with their mom didn't get a chance to mature. Their stories didn't get a chance to grow. And they were stuck feeling like a piece of them had got stuck in the past. I hear that a lot.
Mm-hmm. So you found that they were stuck in a certain time of their life.
Yeah, well, emotionally, developmentally, if they hadn't had an adult to help them mature through the developmental tasks that they were facing at the time their mom died or shortly afterwards. Like if you're a teenager, for example, your parents are containing some, ideally, of course, not always, but ideally, containing some of your behavior, teaching you emotional regulation, modeling certain behaviors for you. And if they lost that when a mom died, they often felt that a piece of them had emotionally and developmentally gotten stuck or arrested at that time in their development. And they can mature, in the absence of a parent, but generally they need some adult support or help. And a lot of kids just don't get that, whether it's a mother or a father or a girl or a boy, if they suffer a major loss at that time in their lives and don't have some kind of support structure around them, whether it's family or in the school system or in the bereavement community, they tend to feel that a piece of them just didn't get to grow up.
Mm-hmm. How do children grieve differently than adults?
Well, a child is subject to a developing personality, right? Your personality is emerging and developing over the course of your childhood, your teenage years. Brain development is occurring during that time, and a loss gets folded into that development, and it starts shaping their worldview and their behaviors and their thoughts. It's an existential crisis at any age, of course, but if you're 16 and you learn that the people that you love aren't going to stick around forever, that's a really different experience than learning it for the first, really deeply learning it for the first time at 35, when your personality is pretty well formed and you have hopefully, the resources and the ability to get help for yourself at that time, whether it's by talking with other adults or going to see a therapist or joining a bereavement group. If you're 9, you're completely dependent on the adults around you to get you that kind of support.
Mm-hmm. So important to understand. So tool number 1, when we are unable to engage in the natural process of meaning making, our loss can become frozen in time. Building a community that supports healthy grieving when we come back.
After the rain stops and the wind dies down, when the fire's gone out and the dust settles, we rise up together and become a force of nature all our own. As part of this community, Mediacom stands with you, doing everything we can not only to restore your service, but to help provide emergency communication access, assist relief efforts, and support our neighbors.
AT&T loves to talk about their 1 gig internet, but you can't get it at Beth's house or John's house. It's not available in JoJo's neighborhood or within 100 miles of the Smith family. The truth is, AT&T 1 gig isn't for everyone. Make sure you have access to the fastest. Switch to Mediacom Extreme and get the future-forward speed you need from the 100% gigabit technology network, the fastest for everyone. CenturyLink loves to talk about their 1 gig internet, but you can't get it at Beth's house or John's house. It's not available in JoJo's neighborhood or within 100 miles of the Smith family. The truth is, CenturyLink 1 gig isn't for everyone. Make sure you have access to the fastest. Switch to Mediacom Extreme and get the future-forward speed you need from the 100% gigabit technology network, the fastest for everyone.
Welcome back to Resiliency Matters. Today we are speaking with Hope Edelman, author of Motherless Daughters, and you also are author of Motherless Mothers, because you found that as women who lost their children stepped into that mothering role themselves, they faced a lot of parenting issues. Talk about that.
Right. Women who lose their mothers becoming mothers is the subject of that second book.
Yes.
And I really became familiar with that experience when I started having children of my own. I have two daughters. One's 21 and one's 17. And at the time I wrote the book, they were still rather young. And I was really re-grieving the loss of my own mom and her absence at that time, because I felt myself really longing for her experience, for her wisdom. Now, this is assuming that, that I have had a mom that would have been there for me when my children arrived. Not all mothers do that for their daughters, but I did think that my mom would have been there and wanted to step into that grandmothering role. And I was also mourning the loss of my kids not having their maternal grandmother. So it was all coming up for me at that time. And I started speaking with other women who'd lost their moms and discovered again that we had an awful lot in common. So Motherless Mothers grew out of that personal experience, again, just as Motherless Daughters had. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love that your books are so solid with the research, but they come from this place of lived experience.
Yeah, that's my nature,
powerful.
I think.
Yeah, you do it very well.
As a journalist and a researcher.
Thus your ability to impact millions of people, which is so wonderful. So what type of issues did you find when these women stepped into mothering?
Well, I think from the beginning, they wondered, how can I be a mother if I don't have a mother? There was this sense of like having a deficit because that person wasn't there as a model or as a guide or as a helper. And especially thinking about, how am I going to raise a child beyond the age I was when my mom died? So in my case, that was 17, and I did have those thoughts like, what's it going to be like to raise an 18-year-old or a 21-year-old if I didn't have a mother at that time in my life? So there was this sense of inferiority compared to other women, and ineptitude, perhaps, like projecting themselves into a position of ineptitude, and also, real deep fear that they might die young also and leave their child without a mother, and not wanting to repeat that history in their family. So all of that would come up for them in the motherhood arena, and the commitment to really being a present, involved mother, because they wanted their child to get the best of them while they were there, because they felt that perhaps their mom had not had the opportunity to be aware of that or do that for them when they were young.
Did you ever see these fears be so strong that women would be reluctant to even become mothers?
Oh, sure. I've met women who said, I was afraid of repeating the past. I couldn't bear the thought of becoming a mother and doing that to a child. Or women who said, I had to raise my younger siblings after my mom died. I feel like I've already been a mother. I don't have an interest in becoming one as an adult. Or I'm too afraid of having a relationship where I love someone so much that I could lose them. Or, really, it was often, I don't think I'll know how to be a mother because my mom died when I was so young. I'm afraid to try it. Yeah.
So you host retreats and provide a lot of supports for women. What do you tell these motherless mothers? What is your guidance for them?
Well, if a woman's coming and saying, I don't know if I want to become a mother, because sometimes women will come to the retreat to try to figure that out or to learn from the older women there. These retreats are multi-generational. The last one that just took place in Los Angeles, I think the participants ranged in age from 22 to 70. So the younger women are really coming to learn from the elders, and the older women are coming for themselves, but also to share their experiences with the younger generation and give them what they might not have had. So if a woman says, I don't know if I want to become a mother, I say, well, look, there are a lot of reasons not to have a child. I mean, maybe you just don't like being around children. That's a really legitimate reason, right, to not have a child. But if your fear is that you won't know what to do or you won't have that person there to help you, let's consider whether or not that's a reason not to have a child. Because if you have a really strong impulse to birth and mother a child and raise the next generation, I can tell you it will be harder for you in some ways than it will be for other women. If it might be easier in some ways too, when women have problematic mothers. That's their own form of difficulty, right, in their grandmother, mother, daughter, or child relationship. but I say I would suggest that if you really want to be a mom, that you do it anyway. Because right now, you're imagining what it would be like if your baby were here tomorrow, right? You're imagining that you wouldn't know what to do. But remember, you know, if you're planning to get pregnant or working on getting pregnant and then being pregnant for 9 to 10 months, you have plenty of time to prepare and create a structure for yourself. And there are women out there who will help you and be there for you. So let's talk about what you could lay, what groundwork you can lay in the lead up to that time, rather than thinking if the baby were here tomorrow, I wouldn't know what to do.
And we talk a lot about the social component of grief, and I know you facilitate this in your work with women. What does that look like at your retreats?
Well, it's well established in this culture and accepted by now in 2019 that grief is a cognitive process. We're making meaning of it all the time, that it's a emotional process. You know, we feel emotions, that it's physical too. You know, when we're grieving, we may be sleepless, we may lose our appetites, there may be physical symptoms that we have, but we've lost the part where grief is meant to be a social experience. So these retreats try to bring that back into the culture. And even though it's maybe many years since a loss, and I do retreats for recent loss, adult mother loss as well, but in the early loss groups, there's this sense that we need to even grieve 20 years later or 30 years later in community. So we sit in a circle, and there's anywhere between 22 and 28 women at most of these retreats. And they sit in a circle and they have the opportunity to share their stories and learn from other women's stories. And I watch in the circle this amazing thing happen, which is that you get 26 women sitting in a circle, each of whom has felt perhaps for dozens of years, nobody understands me. I don't know anyone else who's been through the experience. I'm all alone. And you watch them sit in a circle and look around and hear other women's stories and realize, oh, there's 25 other women in this room who understand me. And, you know, I'm not all alone. And you watch that message that they've been telling themselves, that piece of their stories, start being dismantled in real time. And it can be a little disorienting at first if that's been part of your identity, you know, that I'm alone in this and nobody really understands me. But then you just see this collective relief settle in the circle, and the sort of like the intensity of the room goes down a couple notches, where women start feeling, I'm not all alone, there are women who understand me. And then the bonding starts to occur, and the sisterhood and the community starts to grow. And the women leave on a Sunday in such a different place than they were in on Thursday. You see that they're leaving as a group, not as a collection of individuals. And that's the magic, I think, of these retreats. It's only 3.5 days, but a lot can happen in 3.5 days if you're open to it.
Absolutely, such healing work. So here is tool number 2. It is widely accepted that grief has cognitive, physical, and behavioral components. Western culture has abandoned that grief also is meant to be a social experience. We can create a happier and healthier culture by bringing back all elements of grief into both conversation and practice. The long arc of grief when we come back.
After the rain stops and the wind dies down, when the fire's gone out and the dust settles, we rise up together and become a force of nature all our own. As part of this community, MediaCom stands with you, doing everything we can not only to restore your service, but to help provide emergency communication access, assist relief efforts, and support our neighbors.
AT&T loves to talk about their 1 gig internet, but you can't get it at Beth's house or John's house. It's not available in JoJo's neighborhood or within 100 miles of the Smith family. The truth is, AT&T 1 gig isn't for everyone. Make sure you have access to the fastest. Switch to MediaCom Extreme and get the future-forward speed you need from the 100% gigabit technology network, the fastest for everyone. CenturyLink loves to talk about their 1 gig internet, but you can't get it at Beth's house or John's house. It's not available in JoJo's neighborhood or within 100 miles of the Smith family. The truth is, CenturyLink 1 gig isn't for everyone. Make sure you have access to the fastest. Switch to MediaCom Extreme and get the future-forward speed you need from the 100% Gigabit Technology Network, the fastest for everyone.
Welcome back to Resiliency Matters. Today we are speaking with Hope Edelman, my friend and author of Motherless Daughters. And we've been talking about the social components of grief and the impactful work. And you call it magic, and I think in many ways that magical, it's transformative, that work you do and facilitate women experiencing in your retreats. For our listeners who may have experienced loss and are dealing with grief, how can they start to build that community?
Well, if you're a woman who lost your mom, whether it was in the past or recently, there might be a Motherless Daughters group in your community. There are about 60 right now that are operating all over the world. They're in Canada and Australia and the United States and the UK. There's even one in Dubai. And so there might be one. You can check at my website, hopeedelman.com. There's a support group listing there. Or you can start one on your own. Just shoot me an email through the website and I can give you some information. The problem is that if you call a local bereavement center or grief support services and say, my mom died and I'm about to get married or I'm about to become a mom, because these are predictable points when you might have a flare-up of emotion or grief, and I'm having a hard time and do you have a group I can join? They'll ask, how long ago did your mom die? And if you say 10 years or 15 years, they'll say, most places will say we don't have a group for loss that far in the past. We only have services for within the first year or two. So the Motherless Daughters groups can be helpful, or just find other women who've lost a mom. Or if you're an adult who lost a dad during childhood, there's a Fatherless Daughters network out there. And if you're a son who lost a mother, you just find other people who understand the experience, who understand that this isn't something we get over quickly. It's just really important to have people who can appreciate and understand that, whether they've experienced it or not, just who are willing to listen.
And that is not the message we get in our society, that we get
No.
morning. It's a set period of time,
Yeah.
it's a set process, and this is what it looks like, and you're on the other side, or you should be on the other side. Talk about that.
Absolutely. You know, there was a survey done a number of years ago, just like man on the street interviews, asking people how long is it appropriate to mourn the death of a loved one. And the overwhelming majority of people said that it should be a couple days to a couple of weeks, which is shocking, right? If you've had a relationship with someone for 25 years, the expectation that you should be able to get over it in a couple of days or weeks is preposterous, isn't it? It's just, I can't imagine, you know, what would make people think that could actually happen other than these superficial messages that are out there in society, right? We get, the average American gets 3 days of paid bereavement leave, which is barely enough to even plan a funeral, let alone start dealing with the internal shift that occurs. So no, grief is such an individual process. It will take a different amount of time for each person to get through the most acute phase. But I think it's a lifelong process because we're constantly revisiting the loss and the facts of the loss. And as we develop new insights and have new experiences and mature and reach different plateaus or inflection points in our own lives, we're going to look back at that loss and see it differently. And that's what I think makes grieving a lifelong process. It's not all what we think of as traditional grief, where we aren't sure how we're going to get out of bed in the morning and make it through a day. That typically doesn't last throughout someone's lifetime, and if it does, it's very complicated and professional support is called for. But there's a period after that really, really acute phase where we start feeling like, okay, I get it, this person isn't coming back, and I'm going to move forward with the rest of my life, and I'm going to remember them and however is meaningful to me, but I'm going to start having new experiences without them, and I'm going to have moments of joy again. And that's a period I call the after grief, because it comes after what we traditionally think of as grief, but it's very real. And a lot of people won't talk about it because the message is that they should have been over it by now. What's wrong with you? It's been 10 years and you're not over it yet? That's the kind of questions that are out there just in the larger culture. And I do want to specify this is very much particular to Western culture. Grief is very culturally relative. There are other cultures that do a much better job helping people over that, through that long arc and through the after grief period. It's just that ours has lost an appreciation for what that means. We're a culture of rampant individualism and progress and motion, and the idea is we're going to go through the stages, or we're going to go through the tasks or the steps to get us back to normal, without an appreciation that you can't ever get back to normal because normal had that person in it. There's going to be what's called the new normal, which is the rest of your life, essentially.
And I think these terms, certainly the new normal is in our vocabulary, but you talk about the after grief, you talk about the long arc of grief.
Yeah.
I find your wording and your phrases are very helpful for people on the other side.
Thank you, because we don't have a good language for it yet.
Make
and
one
I'm
up.
trying to do my contribution to develop it. It's not easy to create new words, but I'm doing my best. Thank you.
Yes. And an exciting piece of the work you're now delving into focused on the after grief. You have managed to track down some of the women that you interviewed 25 years ago for Motherless Daughters. So
Yes.
you also are providing this unique lens to grieving over time. Tell us
Right.
about what
Right.
you're finding. I know it's early on in this research.
It is, yeah. I have 2 thick binders full of these interviews. I started writing a new book that's going to be about the after grief, and I found myself pretty early on frustrated by the lack of research that tracked people over a long period of time to find out what their relationship to the loss might be like 20 years later, 30 years later. The longitudinal studies that were out there, that's what they're called, really only tracked people for 5 years or 7 years at the most of them. Only a very small handful went beyond that. But then I remember that in my garage in California, I had the interview tapes and transcripts of the women that I'd interviewed in the early 1990s for Motherless Daughters. So with the help of the internet and my, sort of rudimentary research skills, I went looking for them, and I managed to find 15 of them who were willing to be re-interviewed 25 years later. So we did follow-up interviews 25 years later, and then compared their original stories from the early 1990s and the way that they were talking about their loss to the way that they saw it now, 25 years later. And a lot had happened in these women's lives in the intervening time, so we were able to look at them side by side and see how their stories had developed and changed. Really, really fascinating endeavor for all of us.
It certainly is, and as a researcher, that unique contribution you're making to the field of loss, bereavement, and resilience is fascinating and appreciated. So here is tool number 3, do not beat yourself up with social messages that grief should be time limited or look the same for everyone. Grieving is a dynamic, lifelong process that changes as we mature and develop new relationships to the meaning of our loss. Thank you, Hope, for joining us today on Resiliency
Thank you,
Matters.
Mollie.
And thank you, viewers, for joining us on MediaCom MC22, your local programming leader.